Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. As you know, the second of the three jewels, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, or three refuges, is the Dhamma. That's the Pali form Dhamma. In Sanskrit, it's Dharma. That's the same thing. And Dhamma is often thought of as the teaching or the philosophy of the Buddha. There's a sense that that's true, but it's broader than that. The Buddha himself said that he didn't invent or make up the Dhamma. He uncovered it or discovered it pre-existing, that the Dhamma exists whether a Buddha arises or not. And he compared the work of a Buddha in uncovering the Dhamma to finding an abandoned city in the jungle and clearing away the creepers and vines to uncover the city. The city was always there, but it was not known to humankind. So Dhamma, in the deepest sense, it's the expression of reality. The reality is Dhamma. And there's a related word in Pali, Dhammata, which could be translated pretty closely as natural or according to nature. And this is used sometimes in the Pali canon in some of the stories around the Buddha's birth and enlightenment to account for some miraculous occurrences, as when a Buddha is born, when he's enlightened, and when he dies, and at several other critical points in his career. There's a moment when a great light arises that fills 10,000 world systems. And in the sutta that talks about this and other events in the Buddha's life, it says whenever a Buddha arises, this happens. This is Dhammata. It happens for every Buddha. It's Dhammata. It's natural. It's the natural unfolding of events. So Dhammata means natural order of things, but it's extended beyond what we ordinarily think of natural order. And we can see the natural order, the Dhammata, in the world and in ourselves. That direct experience is the greatest teacher. Its more profound wisdom will arise from direct experience of the self, the body and mind, and of the world, of nature. This is a greater teacher than any possibility of books or Dhamma talks or anything else. We can see many of the formulations that the Buddha articulated are evident in nature. We have the law of dependent origination, the Paticca Samuppada, which in its simplest form is just the statement of causality. Because this arises, that arises. Because this ceases, that ceases. When it's expressed like that, it sounds almost too trivial to be bothered with, but it actually is a profound philosophical axiom because it is a foundation stone of Buddhist thought that things arise according to causes and conditions and not otherwise. So it's a denial of randomness or arbitrariness. And this is extended a little bit in the Abhidhamma with the expression that nothing arises without a cause and nothing arises from a single cause. So this is the idea of interdependence, which is most elaborately worked out and developed in the Huayan school of Chinese Buddhism. But it's there in all strains of Buddhism, the idea of the interdependence of things. Understanding and penetrating the reality of this interdependence is one approach into the idea of emptiness, because nothing exists as a self-sustaining entity. Everything exists only as a momentary interplay of other forces. And we can see this play out in the natural world. Flowers would not exist without the earth and the rain and bees. And bees wouldn't exist without flowers. Nothing in nature can exist on its own by itself without arising from a multitude of causes. This also relates to the characteristic of impermanence, because no form that comes into manifestation will persist indefinitely. It arises, it's sustained for a while, and then it ceases. And at different timescales, this applies to all phenomena in the world. Some things are extremely effervescent, briefly existent, like a spark from a fire. But some things persist for a long time, like the fire of the sun, which will last for billions of years. But that too will come to an end. Yeah. And this is all dhammata. There's interdependence, impermanence, and insubstantiality, or emptiness, or not self. That nothing whatsoever can be said to be a discrete, self-existent entity. And there's the characteristic of dukkha, which is translated suffering, but it's broader than that. It's the imperfection and unsatisfying nature of all phenomena. That nothing is in itself integrally perfect or complete. Things are always kind of a work in progress. Certainly in nature we can observe dukkha all over the place, even in the coarsest form of suffering. There's a great deal of suffering in the animal kingdom as beings devour one another. And there's the suffering of hunger, and there's the suffering of satisfying somebody else's hunger. All the multitude of beings in existence are striving to exist. Even to maintain their existence is an effort, is a striving. That becomes easier in the higher planes of existence, but it never really goes away. This is another thing we can learn from nature, observe Dhamma in nature, is to see the working of samsara, the constant churning and turnover of beings. Now, insects live for a season. Larger animals might live for a few years, but there's a constant exchange, a constant turnover. Now, this is samsara. And all the striving and struggling of all these beings in the end comes to naught. They're born, they suffer, and they die. And this drama is being played out billions and billions and billions of times every day in the planet. So this too is Dhammata. This is the way things are. We can observe it in our own beings. We can observe the laws of Dhamma in our own bodies. The body itself is dependently arisen. In the words of the sutta, it's born of mother and father and sustained by rice and gruel. This is the nature of this body. It's not something that is independent. Even every moment you're breathing in and out, you're exchanging molecules with the atmosphere. There's a kind of wonderful factoid that I come across reading a book about the earth, kind of scientific things about the earth, and they were making a point about the volume of air that we breathe relative to the atmosphere. And it asks the question, if you take someone well known from the past, I think they used Isaac Newton, but you could say even the Buddha or Jesus Christ or anybody, some well-known person from far enough back in the past, what are the odds that when you take a breath of air, there's at least some molecules that has passed through his lungs? And the answer is, mathematically, it's almost certain. And the reason is because there are many more molecules of air in a lung, in a full lung, than there are lungfuls in the atmosphere. So it mathematically works out that it's almost guaranteed that every other being, as given enough time for the atmosphere to circulate, you're breathing air that's been breathed by every other being. So there's this level of interdependence. And we're all sharing breath. And there's a constant exchange of molecules as we eat and excrete. We're constantly refreshing the body. The body is best thought of as a form rather than as a thing or a substance. To think of a whirlpool in a creek. If you look at a creek of water, sometimes a little whirlpool will form. And that might persist for hours or even days. But the actual molecules of water are constantly moving in and out. It's only the shape or the form that persists. The more we look at this body of ours, the more we undermine the sense of a self or a discrete entity. Your body is composed of 1 trillion cells, and each cell is a little wonder in itself. The constant activity going on within the cell. The process of the cell making itself and making the proteins that it needs for sustaining itself and for carrying out its functions in the broader body is extremely intricate, involving DNA, 2 kinds of RNA, dozens of different specialized proteins and little cellular machinery. And all this is happening trillions of times every instant in your body. And no one is doing it. There's no direction. You're not controlling, and no one is. There's nobody doing it, but it's done. It happens. The mind is even more effervescent and impermanent than anything in the body. The Buddha said that one who holds to the body, or one who holds to the mind as permanent, is 16 times more foolish than one who holds to the body as permanent. And this is explained in the Abhidhamma, why that particular number, because there's 16 mind moments for every physical moment. So the mind is much quicker than the body. That things are passing in and out of the mind. And there's really, again, nobody doing it. There's a knowing. You having experience, but there's no I actually having the experience. There's just experience. And the more you look for an I or a self, the more confused you become. It's like a house of mirrors. You never find it. You always seem to be looking at it from the outside and then wonder who's doing the looking. A sense of a self or an I only persists because we're not clear enough in our understanding. We're not seeing things at a fine enough grain. When you see things at a very fine grain of what's going on, you see an object of consciousness and consciousness taking an object. You don't see anybody doing that. Well, that's the process of the mind. That's dhammata of the mind. So everything that happens, everything that exists in our mind, in our body, and in the world is dhammata. It follows the laws of nature. It's not random. It's not arbitrary. There's a teaching developed in the commentaries that elaborates on the idea of lawful causation, that categorizes the different types or modes of causality, several or all of which may apply for any given event, because nothing arises from a single cause. It's always interrelated. And there's Dhammanayama, Uttanayama, Bijjanayama, Chittanayama, and Kamanayama. Niyama is the laws or the attributes or rules of causation. Uttanayama, Uttu means heat or temperature, and that refers to events in the climate, or very broadly defined, like including geological forces, the actions of the sun and the earth and the atmosphere. This is Uttanayama. Bijjanayama is seed law. So this is genetics. This is the way beings arise and follow from previous generations of beings. New generations arrive that pass on characteristics. That's the Bijjanayama. Chittanayama are the laws of the mind. The mind too is dhammata. It's subject to lawful unfoldment. It's not random or arbitrary any more than the physical universe. Kamanayama is the rules or laws governing the making and experiencing of kama and kama resultant. And this is dhammata. It's nothing magical or mystical about it. It's natural law. It's dhammata. To understand the workings of kama in detail is something beyond, the Buddha said it was beyond human ken, that it's so subtle and complex, but we can understand the broad brush principles. First of all, we have to go back to the opening words of the Dhammapada, that mind is the forerunner, mind is the chief, that the body and the physical universe arise out of mind and not the other way around. Mind is the more basic or primordial factor. Mind shapes the experience that we have, including the external world. So when the law of karma is best understood, people maybe when they first encounter it, think of it as some kind of judgment or some kind of moral code with rewards and punishments, but it's not really that. It's a natural balancing. We can see in the physical laws of the universe that there is a natural tendency for the universe to always balance itself. For every negative charge, there's a positive charge. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That whatever is done to a closed system will result in some reaction elsewhere in the system to bring it back to its zero state. And we see this articulated in things like the laws of motion, the laws of conservation of motion and conservation of angular momentum, so far as the physical world is concerned. So when we make an action with volition, it originates in the mind. Any action that we do originates first in the mind, and that creates a ripple in the universe. And karma is only made by the ignorant. The Arahant makes no karma. It's like we're stumbling around in the dark and knocking things over. We don't really know what we're doing. Now, everything we do is a little disturbance, a little ripple in the fabric of the universe. And as the greater cosmos, the samsara as a whole, comes back to 0 point, you feel the ripple of that. That's the resultant of your karma. The last niyama, although it's usually listed first, I'm just dealing with it last here, is the Dhamma niyama, which is broadly speaking what I'm talking about in this discourse, is the laws of Dhammata, the laws of nature broadly conceived. So any event that occurs, anything you experience, is dependent on these niyamas. And always more than one, a combination of niyamas are going on. Like let's say, let's take a kind of example at random. Let's say you go out for a walk and you're not anticipating it, but it starts to rain and you get soaked and very, very unpleasant sensation. You're cold and wet. And, so that, first of all, there's a rule in Abhidhamma that every sense experience whatsoever has karma as a component because it's classed as a resultant, a karma resultant. So there's some karma there. There's something you've done in the past, in this life or in a previous life, that merited the karma of getting wet and miserable. But that's not entirely the whole story, because your karma did not cause the rain. The rain is caused by utunuyama. It's caused by movements in the atmosphere. And it's nothing to do with your volition or your will. Only the fact that you experience it at this time, at this moment. And the laws of Chittaniyama will apply when the feeling of being wet and cold is perceived as unpleasant, and then an unhappy feeling arises. So these are the resultant unfolding of Chittaniyama. We don't choose to be happy or to be sad. We don't choose to enjoy a pleasant experience or dislike a painful one. We may seek these things out, but the resultant feeling is not something we choose or is under our control. So the unfolding of these laws altogether is dhammata. It's a natural unfolding of the self and the mind and the world. And together they constitute the experience of samsara. And we're caught in this this web, this complex interplay of forces. But there is that possibility, which is part of the Dhamma as well. There is the possibility of breaking out of that. And this is the Eightfold Noble Path of the Buddha. You know, in the first and second truths, he lays out dukkha and the cause of dukkha, which is tanha, or craving. In the third, he states that there is that which is not this. There is the unconditioned. And in the fourth truth, he lays out the way to find that. So as human beings, we do have that capacity that we can find a way out of this samsaric existence. It's not an absolutely determined, inescapable labyrinth. Some of the philosophers of India had held that there is a way out of it. And it begins with understanding reality, penetrating it, not just an intellectual grasp, but an actual penetration with the mind of the true nature of reality at a very fine, granular level. And this makes possible the release of the second truth, the release of craving, which the Buddha told us we should learn to abandon. And when you see things at that very fine level, you're not fooled by them anymore. You're able to step back from them. And the craving of the mind diminishes. And eventually that process, which is the dhammata of the mind at the finest level, which is mind taking an object, can come to an end. These objects are called in Abhidhamma, they're called Dhamma. And it's not just a random homonym. There's a reason why the word is used here, because it's the finest grain or the most immediate expression of Dhamma. You know, the Dhamma, broadly conceived, is the whole universe. But a Dhamma expresses in its nature, the single Dhamma expresses in its nature the same qualities as the whole universe. It's empty, it's impermanent, it's dependently arisen. So these laws apply at all scales. So there's a sense in which you've seen one Dhamma, you've seen them all. All you need to do is penetrate one Dhamma absolutely, and the whole mess unravels.
Handamayan Dhamma Kataya Sadhukaram Dadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodami.